Hey, what's up everybody? Rob Marzullo here from Ram Studio Comics. Welcome back. So in today's video, I'm actually going to share 4 lessons with you from my newest course, Introduction to Digital Painting and Photoshop. And what we'll be covering in these lessons are quick mask and selections, layers and groups, pencil brush settings, as well as painterly brush settings. You also learn valuable shortcut commands as we progress through this course. Keep in mind, if you like these lessons and want the full course, there's going to be a link in the description box below, and you also get the custom brushes as well as any art files to work along with. So let me know in the comments section below what you think of these free lessons, and more content is on the way very soon. So without further ado, let's jump on in. Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about quick mask and also feathering your selections. So I want you to be aware that there's lots of ways to edit your selections, which in turn aids in the painting process quite a bit. So one of the things you can do is, after generating some kind of selection, in this case with the freehand lasso tool, you can hit Q on your keyboard and you can get a mask that's actually visually represented with this pink kind of color. Now notice that this icon right here is what controls it. See that? And also notice that the color swatches here change from red to gray to black and white. Now the reason that is you can now select any brush that you desire, and you can draw into this mask. And then if you hit Q again, it turns back into a selection. So this is very powerful because you can pick any brush you want. Doesn't matter. It can have texture, it can have rigid edges, it just doesn't matter. Whatever you can think of. So you can draw with this, and you can paint back your selection, and you can hit X, which flips your color swatches, and with dark, you can now paint back in your selection. This works with soft brushes, and notice even this, let me zoom in here and show you, even this overlap texture that has a slight variation in intensity. So here's another variation in the intensity of the selection, right? I can hit X and I'm pressing very light just so I get that variation of what this texture does. If I hit Q, it looks like it's been washed away and we only have a selection. But if I make sure I'm on a new layer, and I grab my paint bucket tool and I fill this with a flood fill and hit Command D to deselect, notice that it retained all of that variation. So a highly powerful effect for really isolating a certain area of your painting and getting some unique effects. Now another thing to think about is feathering your selection. That's kind of what we just did there with more control. So I actually prefer to use the quick mask, but sometimes there's that instance where you need to use a specific shape, or you just want to blend out the edges to a specific area. That's where feathering comes in. So for instance, if I draw this rectangular shape and I flood fill it, I get a solid box, and this edge of this solid box is going to be pretty tight based on whatever size document you're working on. So for instance, if I zoom in and I keep zooming in, I'm eventually going to get some pixelation at the edge, but it's going to occur sooner if it's a low resolution file size. We made sure that in the beginning this was a pretty nice sized document, so that edge clarity is going to be retained. So for instance, if I hit Command A and I delete what's on the canvas or on the layer, Command D to deselect, and I grab this same tool, but I put a feather of about 25 pixels, watch the difference. Notice too that it even rounded the edge. It's not that crisp, solid edge that it was. You see the difference there? Now keep in mind, I got to make sure I wasn't zoomed in too far, because whatever size is going to be relative based on that pixel amount that we added the feather for. But now what it did is it softened up that edge. So by adjusting that feather, you can control that, and that works with any of these shapes. So you can grab an elliptical, maybe make that 50 pixels. Make sure that there's no existing selection. Draw that in there, flood fill, and the fade is going to be even larger. And you can see it's actually blending to both sides of that line. So again, very effective for controlling the way that your selections work and ultimately controlling the way that your painting will work. So that'll bring this one to a close. Let's move on to the next lesson. Okay, so now I want to talk to you about layers and groups. So if you go over here to the layers icon and we add a new layer by clicking this icon here, you can also do this with the shortcut command of Command J. And notice if you keep adding those, it'll give them numeric values. And notice that it's also adding these to the topmost area because that means it's in front of anything below it. So I'm going to hit Command Z, Command Alt Z to go back because we only need one of these for now. I just want to show you how these really function in a sense of hierarchy. So if you grab a brush and grab a color, we'll say red here, and we'll just paint a little bit of red. And then we'll hit Command J, add a new layer. And actually it duplicated the existing layer. So actually let's go back and hit Command Z and let's go layer, new layer. So it's going to be Command Shift N for new layer. And it's actually going to allow you to name it here. So this box can be nice if you want to set blending modes. You can also colorize the layer. So for instance, you can give it a color code like this. You can immediately change your blending mode and opacity all here as well as name it. So let's just call this top layer and hit enter. So you see it color coded it here, it named it here, it even placed it at the top again. But then what we want to do now is add a different color, paint over top of that. Now notice too that just with the opacity of the brush you get a different tone, but if I adjust the opacity here, it's going to let that other color show through. We're also going to get into blending modes and things like that, but I just want you to see how these layers work. So again, if you just want a plain layer and you don't want to worry about any of these presets that you get by going to this shortcut command of Command Shift N, you can just hit this icon here. It's going to give you a basic layer. You can also get that again by just dragging and clicking on top of there. And that's going to copy it as well. So if we take it here and drag there, notice it gives us an exact copy of even the presets. So just remember that dragging that and releasing there will give you an exact copy. So hit Command Z to go back. So now what I want to do is show you how the hierarchies work. So if you keep adding layers, they're only going to stay to the left side of this column and they're all going to arrange that way. If we add a group by clicking on this icon and then click, hold Shift and grab the bottom, or you can just hit Command and grab individual layers and skip layers. But now when you grab and drag, those will grab together and you can drop them into the group. So now notice that these two layers have been moved over to the right. So that's showing you the hierarchy and the way it works. So for instance, if I was to grab this group, drag it over to the new layer icon, it's actually going to duplicate the group. If I was to grab this group, and remember you can condense these down. So this is how you kind of organize your work. But if I grab this group here and I bring it into the group, notice that it segued over even further. And then if I open that group, the column is over even a bit further to the right. So this is how you're going to kind of distinguish your hierarchy. And then again, you can click these, right click, and you can color code these if you need to as well. So notice since everything's in this group, it color coded all of them together. And if I go back one by one, I can change these inside of the group like that. So you've got the color coding, you've got the hierarchy, you've got layers, you've got groups, and you can condense these down to really save space. So when you start getting to these advanced paintings that you're going to do, this can be a great way to kind of itemize all your work, organize it, and get it the way you need. And keep in mind too, when everything's in a group like this, you can toggle off and on the visibility, and you can also adjust the entire group. So for instance, if I hit Command T, not only can I move this all around together, except for the one layer that's outside of the group, obviously, I can rotate it, I can hold Shift and grab a corner and scale it proportionately, hit Enter, and all of that information maneuvered together. So very important to realize what you can do with groups and layers in that regard. Also keep in mind if you're on this group and you've got all these different things going on and you want to condense it down to just a layer, you can simply hit Command E and notice that it takes everything from that group. And let me go back and add a few things just so you can see. If we have a little bit of paint work here, like this, we'll grab a different color. Put that on another layer inside this group. So we've got a lot of different things going on there. We simply go to that group, hit Command E, and it merges it all together. See that? So a really neat way to kind of not only separate your work and itemize it and work through something, but then to conserve space and really organize your work, you can clean up your desk, so to speak, and just hit Command E on that group. And that works with multiple layers as well. So if you have these two layers selected and you hit Command E, it's going to merge those together. Now everything's unified. So that's kind of how I use layers and groups. There's, obviously a lot that can go into it, but that'll get you moving and able to, work through your digital painting or your comic work and get everything organized and utilize it in the best regard. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to our next lesson. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about the brushes a bit more. And brushes are very in-depth. There's a lot to it. So what I want to do is first get you up and rolling with basic brush settings so that you can create basic drawings, basic paintings, and then we'll delve into brush creation and, because there's just a lot that goes into custom brush creation and a lot of ability, but I don't want to overburden you with that yet. I want you to just understand how to get a basic thick to thin line. That's probably the most important. That's what I remember the most when I got started. Like how come I'm not getting the lines that I want? The first thing that happens is you want to be aware of your brush shape. You want to make sure that your driver for whatever device you're using is working. So you're going to want to test that, and obviously that goes into a lot of different devices, but make sure that your pressure sensitivity works. You want to go into the brush presets, and the first thing you want to enable is shape dynamics. So for instance, if this is not enabled, look at the preview there. I'm going to go ahead and use the bracket keys to scale this brush up. Or I can obviously do it there. You can see it moving interactively right there. And up here as well. So this is what the brush looks like. This is a preset chalk brush that comes with Photoshop. Notice that if nothing's set, I just get this big blob of black on the screen. And there's no pressure sensitivity. There's no line weight, nothing. So when I go to shape dynamics, if I check that and I select it, so select by clicking to the right, and I can look at all these different sliders, and the main thing is pen pressure. So you've got fade, pen pressure, pen tilt, stylus wheel. You got to make sure that your tablet supports these. And remember, a mouse doesn't support any of these. You might be able to get fade to work because generally the preset can be set to an opacity. So you can kind of emulate it, but it's not really going to work. So basically, you just make sure that your tablet's working, and let's go to pen pressure for the line weight. So I'm going to scale this down, and notice that just that right there, I don't get a whole lot. I get basically, let's see if I press very light and then I press hard, that's the variation I get. So not enough for a good drawing tip yet. Scale this down and check it. Yeah, it's just not giving me the variation. So what I want to do here is double check that size jitter is not on. And then look at the difference there, a nice smooth line. So let's scale this back even further. Press down max weight. So this is a good test right here. You want to press very light, press hard, press light again. And you should be able to get a nice variation of line weight. That's what's going to allow you to create the illustrations that you want, or at least the style of illustrations I like for drawing and mainly inking. So this is the type of brush that I would create. So the things to keep in mind is that the size jitter is off, because we notice as we increase this size jitter, we got a very textured brush. Now this isn't a bad brush, especially if you're going for a rigid line around something, but you just have to make sure that that's exactly what you want. If it's not, then remember that keeping the size jitter down is going to give you that nice smooth line. The other thing that actually affects that, smoothing is kind of an just a setting that you can add, and I don't typically see a large difference there, but mainly when you go to brush tip shape, making sure that your spacing is all the way down. So it's almost like jitter in the sense that if you increase the spacing, you start to get this rough edge because it's actually taking the brush tip and it's spacing it out. So you start to get this overlap of the edges of the brush tip. So when it's a circle, it just becomes a series of dots. But when it's a chalk brush, you get this kind of rigid edging until eventually when you space it out, it's very noticeable. But again, if you're going for a fluid line, you can just turn that all the way down. You can also control the brush tip by squeezing it and rotating it here. So that's how you control the direction of the brush tip based on the orientation of the pen. So this can offer some pretty unique results as well. And the main thing is that after every change, you should test exactly what you did. Make sure that that's something that you're going to want to see within your brush design. Now obviously these brush settings are going to get very advanced. So what I want to do is just show you again the basic concepts of what it takes to create. In this case it would be kind of an inking brush or just a good line brush. You want to also keep in mind that you can just adjust the opacity itself as you're utilizing it, and you can get a bit more sketching done with just that. So it kind of emulates the way that pencil lines would kind of build up to give a darker pencil line. So don't underestimate your opacity as well. So the other thing is to make sure that when you have the difference from, say, a pencil brush, and keep in mind you'll get access to all of these so that you can play around with these and see what settings you like. And you're also welcome to comment and let me know what settings you'd like to see explained a bit further. But again, we're going to start very basic and get you up and running. So if you look at this pencil brush, it's got a bit of texture. It's got a little bit of that line weight, thick to thin. And also, as I press lighter, I get a more faint line without controlling the opacity as we did before. But then if I press harder, I get a nice solid dark line with a little bit of edging to it. So let's see how that's achieved. So now we have shape dynamics. Remember, none of this is on really except for pen pressure. We've got some texture, and we selected a pre-defined texture inside of Photoshop. You can create those as well. It's actually set to invert. You're usually not going to see a tremendous amount of difference, but it's helpful to pay attention to that. We've got some scale. Scale is going to increase the size of the texture in relation to the brush. We've got some brightness, some contrast, depth. All of that's going to make the grain more apparent in the brush tip. We also have transfer set. Now this is important to note because this is what gives you kind of a painterly brush. There's a little bit of that set up with pen pressure, and that's the part that's giving us this very light and this dark. Notice if I take this off, now it's back to kind of an inking brush. So transfer is very important to pay attention to, and you can copy these settings, but it's mainly the idea of what we're going to use even to explain some painting brushes. So probably first and foremost is that any shape can really become a pencil brush with some basic settings. Now this is a circle. You can use circles, squares. It's going to kind of condense it down and make it to a point anyways. But there are oftentimes brushes look a little bit better with just a tiny bit of a randomized shape. It just seems to feel a little bit more natural to me. But you also have to weigh the options as to whether or not you receive any brush lag from introducing more variables. So the more all this is kind of set up, and the larger the initial brush tip is designed at, and again we'll talk about this later, then chances are you're going to get a tiny bit more lag. So if you download some brushes from a custom set or whatever, and you start to get lag, you might want to look around. It may be that the brush was created too large for your current setup. So just be aware of that. So that'll conclude this lesson. Next we're going to talk about some of the paintbrush settings and get you up and rolling with that. So let's move on. Okay, so now I want to talk to you about painting brushes. Now notice they're all in the same area, and I've just got a ton of different brushes because I've created many over the years. But the difference is with the painting brush, notice that any painting brush I select is going to have a little bit of texture to it, and not always with the texture, but mainly the transfer. This is always going to be enabled with any paint brushes I use. Now let me show you some of the ones that are more popular for the way that I paint. One of which is this basic 009 hard round brush. And you're going to have a basic hard round brush inside of Photoshop regardless. But what's happened here is I just make sure to set my transfer on, no shape dynamics. The brush tip is a basic circle, and the spacing is down, hardness is up. It's actually pretty simple, but all that it really does for me is it gives me this nice smooth fade of light to dark. Now, if I can't get an extremely light version, and I'm talking like where I can barely see what I'm putting down, then I'm not really set up to paint in the way that I like. So let me explain that real quick. Now this may vary based upon what you're using, but I use a Wacom tablet, It's a Cintiq. If I go to this tablet driver, I'm going to be able to go in here and adjust my tip feel. This is an overall firmness to the way that you paint. If you're heavy-handed, you're actually going to set it more to firm, and then what happens is I can now achieve a lighter tone. I can still get the dark tone with lots of pressure, but it's easier for me to get to that lighter tone that I like. So let me illustrate that again by adjusting this setting again. So I'll just show you the very extreme. So it's good to play around with these and really check it, but I'll set it to firm all the way there. I'm actually putting pressure right now and you can't see it. And there I'm actually applying a fair amount of pressure just to get paint to come out. The reason why I like this, when I'm trying to be very subtle with the way that I paint, this actually works better for me. Now, most artists might disagree, or everyone's going to have a different level of pressure sensitivity preferences. So what you have to do is test this and make sure it works well for you. It's going to be a matter of what you can blend well with, what you can apply just the right amount of paint with. But all I can tell you is if you go to paint and you're getting this way too quick, then you may need to adjust the pressure sensitivity within your actual driver. And again, that's what this is here. I'm just showing you the actual driver setting to this particular device that I use. Again, this is going to vary with lots of different types of devices, but if you have the same type, then you may see something like this, and you're going to adjust that in here. There's other things like calibration, I disable brush settings, things like that, but mainly just be aware that you want to be able to get that nice soft feel. Now I adjust that differently for using pencil brushes than I do for painting. You can also control that with your opacity. So for instance, you might find a nice happy medium where you don't have to jump in here and adjust things. I'll generally set it to about something like that. And that way I can paint pretty quickly because I'm not really struggling to put paint down. But I may even bump back the opacity as I go and just realize to get those darker darks, I may need to hit that area a few times. So that's essentially how I paint. Now back to the brush settings. This is the most basic of brushes, no texture really involved. But then there's sometimes that I will get a brush with a textured edge. So you see for the inside, it's pretty much the same type of brush, but for the perimeter shape, it's been affected in a way where it gives a nice texture. So that's one way to apply texture. And then another is going to be like the brush I showed you previously, where it has texture or stippling to the inside. I think even this one looks like it does. So here we can get texture more on the inside of the brush. And there's lots of various ways to do that. There's grain, like we already talked about, under the texture tab here. And there's actually controlling the brush tip itself. So you can see by the thumbnail here, if I was just to stamp this on the screen, there's actually texture within the brush tip itself. It's not a solid brush in the middle, it's got some variation. So lots of ways to introduce texture with your painting brushes and get lots of cool build up to your paintwork. And we'll talk more about that as we start to utilize these. Even hair brushes, just made with a series of dots. I'll be showing you how to do that. And you can get lots of great hair texture really quickly just by utilizing some shortcuts within the brush design. And as you probably already know, texture can really enhance your painting rather quickly. So that'll complete these free lessons. If you want to know more, check out the link in the description box below and get the full course. As always, keep drawing, keep having fun, and I will talk to you soon.